May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free of economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the confines of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today we have some more pieces from the work in progress, Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. We're going to start off with a piece about Bill Lambert. Quite a character. And we're going to get right into that after a pause to meditate. So, when you hear the bell, if you're of a mind, hit pause and meditate or whatever for as long as you like. And when you're through, hit unpause and come back, and we'll all have returned from our meditation or whatever at the same time. So, here we go. Lambert. Driving into Tassajara, we'd pass through Jamesburg. Population, not many, and hard to say because it's all spread out. And where does Jamesburg begin or end? Drive by a few homes, and between a barn and ranch house that belonged to Bill and Marion Lambert. Until 1972, when the Zen Center got the Jamesburg house where the dirt road begins. Lambert's was our way station. Enter by the back door after passing a row of dog houses with chained hunting dogs barking at our approach. Bill would usually be sitting at the large dining table, Marion often behind the stove stirring boar meat stew. Marion was sweet and thoughtful. Bill was sour and ornery, but engaging and generous after some insults. When True Grit came out in 1969, some teased him with that name, but really, he was grittier than John Wayne. Bill Gordon Lambert was the son of local rancher William B. Lambert, who was the son of William H. Lambert, who, with his brother Thomas, was a whaler from Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Bill G., the one we knew, said they used to land in Big Sur to get supplies and timber, and finally sold their ship and stayed there. I think the Lambert fortunes were on the decline with Bill G. Lambert Ranch was 5,000 acres, but he didn't seem to have many cows, was mainly leasing land out and selling it off piece by piece. Maybe some money taking people boar hunting. He and his sons and other young guys that hung out around there would help the sheriff with searches for people lost in the woods. They'd find bodies and talk about that. One was so decomposed that the head came off and rolled down a ravine, and they had to go find it. They'd brag about their boar conquests, such as leaping onto the back of one with only a knife to cut the beast's throat. I'd see skinned boar or deer hanging up in the barn. Later, I'd join in on eating them. Marion operated the Jamesburg branch of the county library and Jamesburg post office, both of which were so obscure that I don't know where they were. In the house? A lot of oak and pine on the land. Sometimes Lambert sold firewood. I went out with him to get some for his own use, drove up into his land in his pickup, and he cut down a green tree. Told me he only has to use dry wood to start the fire in the kitchen's wood-burning stove, and that he only does that once. It would burn all winter. There was a little creek gurgling by where the tree was he cut. He pointed to it and said, "It's running now, but it'll go dry in July. All the creeks around here used to run year-round till they started testing the atomic bomb." And he said that, pronouncing the first letter that way. He used to sell hay. One customer was Kim Novak in the Carmel Highlands. He and his son Rod had done tractor and backhoe work. In 1949, Bill bulldozed the shell of the burned Tassajara Lodge into the basement. Bill was bitter about government restrictions on how he could use his land. There were livestock restrictions. They wouldn't let him put in a trailer park. He'd say that when there's a socialist takeover of America, it will be led by the U.S. Forest Service. And the more he drank, the more vocal he'd get about that, and crude, as in, "I'd like to run a red-hot poker up the ass of every goddamn Forest Service bureaucrat." Fire lookout Fred Tuttle said that Lambert was really just mad at himself for throwing away his life on alcohol. Sometimes Lambert would go on a heavy binge, drink so much he couldn't even sit at the kitchen table, and then Marion might get fed up and join him. Going out on a shopping trip, I found them both in bed. He told me to go to the grocery store in Carmel Valley Village and get them 2 quarts of vodka and 2 gallons of red wine, a carton of cigarettes, and a few things to eat. Put it on his tab. Store owner... Pardon me. Store owner sighed, said Bill was much and long overdue, but that he'd get on Jags like this every couple of years and then pay it all back, so okay. One day Bill said he'd seen a mountain lion with cubs on the road up a ways, ran back to get his rifle, but the felines were gone when he returned, complained he hadn't had mountain lion stew in a long time. I was happy he didn't get his wish. Bill always had horses, but he was no horse whisperer. He told me the way he'd break a horse was to deny them food and water for a while. I heard so many stories about Lambert and didn't know what was true or not. No matter. Heard he'd lost his ranch to neighbor rancher Esalen Indian Fred Nason in a card game in the 40s, and that a few years later Nason let him win it back. Was told by a bartender up at the Stirrup Cup in Carmel Valley that Lambert had been introduced to a big Hollywood producer in their years back, and that he'd spat on the man's shoes saying, "What do you have to say about that?" "I say I'll buy you a drink," was the reply. Bob Beck said that I reminded him of Lambert. Why? Because I drink all your booze? I guess so, because Bob then told how when he and Anna first bought Tassajara around 1959, they'd heard Lambert was suspicious of them city folks taking that place over. Lambert had grown up riding a horse from Church Creek Ranch over to Tassajara and always went there any time he felt like it. The Becks invited him and Marion over for dinner. Soon as they arrived, Lambert asked if there was any alcohol. Bob brought out a box with 20 partially empty bottles, remnants of various kinds of booze they'd brought from San Francisco. In the course of the evening, Lambert not only drank it all up, but another box full just like it that Bob retrieved from one of the walk-in reefers out back. Bob said that when the Lamberts left, Bill said, "I think you're going to be all right." When Bill got in the Jeep that night to go home, he started backing up on the Tassajara Road in the dark. Marion called out, "I'm afraid he's going to do it, but I have to go with him." He backed up all the way over the ridge, past the drop-offs, and round the hairpin curves, the 14 miles to Jamesburg. Bob said that after that, when people would ask Bill what the new people at Tassajara were like, Bill would say, "Goddamn good." Bill was deputized so he could deal quickly with problems in the woods for the sheriff. Bob called Bill to say there were some out-of-control guys who were drunk and shooting guns carelessly at Tassajara. Bill slid in record time and said, "Put up the hardware, boys." Bob said the guys wilted in Bill's presence, and Bill escorted them out. Part of being around Bill was being around guns. I heard he'd practice shooting a rifle from the kitchen table through an open window across the road, sometimes frightening the occupants of passing cars. I saw him shoot holes in his kitchen wall with a pistol. And his guests might have guns. There were a couple of tough guys I'd see there at times, Billy and Don. One late afternoon, Stan White had a flatbed truck full of 55-gallon drums of gasoline and kerosene he was bringing back into Tassajara. Billy was out there drunk and taunting him, shooting bullets dangerously close to the flammables. Don standing by laughing. Bill Lambert said that Tassajara and all the private land within the Los Padres National Forest in Monterey County was surveyed wrong. He said that the surveyors mainly stayed in his house, got drunk, and guessed. He said, as long as we're strong, the Forest Service will leave us alone. But that back in the 40s, when some nearby rancher was broke, they took his best land and traded it for steep mountainside, showing that's what he owned according to the survey. When I was Tassajara director in the mid-70s, I looked into that survey situation. Those surveys were long ago, and he was talking about the surveyor staying in his childhood home, which was Church Creek Ranch. There would have been plenty of booze there, especially during Prohibition, because old man Lambert was making top-grade whiskey at Church Creek. Revenuers raided the place, found a still, and found booze at the Lambert home in Jamesburg as well. Bill Lambert Sr. had to pay a $200 fine. Bill said, "We sold moonshine whiskey to the finest people in Salinas, judges, padres, church-going people. We got $20 a gallon for it because it was so pure." The ranch flourished then. It was a sad day. It was a sad day when they repealed Prohibition. There's a history of poor surveying in those woods. The original plat, or map of the area, published in 1884 by a surveyor named John D. Hall, had Tassajara in the wrong quadrant and Church Creek Ranch a half-mile off. Hall got 10 years for surveying fraud. But that was even before Lambert's father's time, so I envisioned waves. So I envisioned waves. So I envisioned waves of fraudulent surveys. I got confused trying to figure it all out and didn't look into it further because our noble advisor, prominent attorney and Tassajara loyal guest, Charles Page, assured me that over 100 years of use had established where our property and all the property was, and don't worry about it. We paid Page and, well, not we, I did. Gonna fix that. I paid Page and family occasionally with 8 loaves of Tassajara bread fresh out of the oven that morning. He'd freeze 6. We didn't give any booze to Bill, but he liked us. He'd call us bald-headed hippies. Said the lot of us were crazy and a bunch of educated idiots, but we were straight shooters who didn't put on airs. He said to my sister and me, she wasn't crazy, just energetic, "You Chadwicks got ants in your pants." My wife, Diane, asked if it was okay to breastfeed Kelly at his kitchen table, and Bill said, "Any woman who wants to breastfeed a baby is welcome in my home." I'd agree with Bob Beck that Bill Lambert was a stalwart friend to many of us, and to Tassajara. It seemed to me he was abusive to live with. When Marion was dying of cancer, I played her some nice songs, and I could hardly get through them, for Bill is yelling at me to forget about that mush and play some shit-kicking music. I'd say I wasn't there for him, but for her, and he'd say he didn't care, play some of that good stuff. He was loyal too, but hard on his family. I only saw that in the way he treated long-suffering and quiet Marion, and in the eyes of his grown kids when they were there. Last time I saw Bill, I took my 12-year-old son Kelly to visit him in a trailer up by where we'd cut the firewood. I think his eldest son, Bill, was living in the house then. Bill, the father, was still mad at me for getting the name of the road changed to Tassajara Road. I'd seen to that because we'd had so many guests drive on and get lost because they saw a sign that read Kashawa Road, even though we made sure people coming our way had good directions. Because of that, he said people now couldn't find Kashawa, which forked off before Jamesburg. He talked about gun laws, how he needed to have his gun on him, not hidden away, because when somebody was pulling a gun on him, there wouldn't be time to open up the glove box. I think Kelly was shocked by his bitterness and foul language. Bill went on about the government and the Forest Service in venal terms. Last I heard of him, there'd been a big get-together for his 80th birthday. But I also see he died in Jamesburg 11 days short of it on May 11th, 1991, so maybe they had it early. Gosh, that was a while back. His son, Bill, William R. Keith Lambert, died recently, 2015, in Jamesburg at the age of 80. If you mention the name Bill Lambert these days in the Jamesburg-Kashawa area, Bill's son, Bill, is the one they'll think of. And when I first got there, when old-timers spoke of old Bill Lambert, it was Bill's father. I was glad Bill Gordon Lambert lived that long. I remember He'd told me in the 70s that a doctor had scared him, told him if he didn't stop smoking and drinking, he wouldn't live much longer. So he changed his ways finally. Bill Lambert did live longer and was loved because of who he was and despite who he was. Exiled. Bob Halpern and I obeyed almost all the rules and followed the schedule. Sometimes we'd add to it, though, and bend the rule of silence after the last zazen and the rule of go to bed, jabbering about what we thought was the Dharma in our rooms, or take walks and jabber about our teachers and fellow students and other teachers and their students. Sometimes we'd go to the baths in the dark dead of winter, leap into the 108-degree plunge, get under a cold shower and leap into the plunge from the railing, then to the steam room and freezing cold creek, hanging onto the cable that ran across the creek, back and forth with the temperature extremes. Bob and I were asked to skip the winter-spring practice period in early 1968, but we were free to come back for the spring interim and guest season. They said they wanted to start rotating people, but we knew they also wanted to give Tassajara a break from us. But why not send just one? All they did was move the problem. In the city, Bob and I continued to be hyper and distract people from their pure practice. We were some sort of codependent. Saw every movie in town during that time. We seduced every woman we could. That was mainly him. He had a knack. We didn't drink or get stoned, so that was good. That's on him. He just didn't have those urges. We didn't miss zazen either, and did stuff for the Zen Center over at Sokoji. We ate our meals orioki, but not in the apartment's communal kitchen and dining area. In my room, as his was too messy. We would chant the whole long meal chant and play Zen without interruption. We'd make strict macrobiotic meals, brown rice, miso soup, cooked vegetables. A typical evening would be for us to go to a movie after that, then weekend and get a hamburger and a milkshake. Go back, sit zazen until late at night, and then go out and run around. Rise for early zazen, kinin, zazen, service at Sokoji, in which we'd be nodding like those little dipping, drinking bird toys. It was only for 3 months, so neither of us got a job. Once after a late post-theater zazen, he begged me to come out with him, but I was tired. Later, I was awakened by a slam of the door downstairs, the sound of footsteps, and then an effeminate voice from below calling out, "Bobby! Bobby!" Bob had met a woman hanging out late night on Polk Street. They'd talked, closed a bar, and gone into the bushes outside the Episcopal Church at Goff and Geary. That's where Bob discovered that she was a he. And Bob, lost interest. But the other he, or she, as the case may be, was still interested in romance, and now downstairs calling up and waking our neighbors for sure. And finally, he went back down. They had a nice chat in which the former object of his desire was calmed by his platonic sweet talk. So just as I'd seen him lure all sorts of females into hasty togetherness, he made this foul maiden accept their separation. Bob could sell sun lamps to Tahitians. Bob and I wore cheap zoris, but we preferred wearing zoris that were short so that the toes stuck a little bit over the edge. Almost anything we did would have a dharmic or health-related reason. The reason for the short stories was mindfulness. As a result, we frequently had bloody toes, especially the big one from stubbing them on some protrusion, especially at Tassajara, where there was so much uneven rockiness. Bob said that we could know our state of mind by looking at our feet. One day in the city on a shopping trip for several of the railroad apartments full of zinnies, we drove to the Oakland Food Mill, which was one of the best places to get grains, nut butters, and other wholesome, nutritious foodstuffs. Then we drove to Telegraph Avenue to enjoy the scene with hippies and students. Bob went barefoot and shirtless, saying, "Let's go with the flow. Be natural." While strutting around thus, he stepped on a piece of glass from a broken bottle of cheap wine that lay next to her reclining figure. It was a bad cut, lots of blood. Went to a clinic where they sewed him up. I looked at his bandaged foot and asked, "What's your state of mind today?" The car we drove was a 10-year-old Volvo I'd bought from a guy in the East Bay who said he was Ed Fox. "Ed the Fox," he said. "Ring a bell?" Turned out I had heard of him. He'd stowed away on a flight from Australia to L.A. and made the headlines because he'd survived. As I recall, it was in with a wheel, but I don't know if that's really possible. Anyway, Bob and I decided I should have a car, so one of us could be on call to drive Suzuki Roshi or Oksan wherever they wanted to go. Ended up doing a lot of errands for Yvonne and Gloria Kunin in the office. Whatever was wanted, we were on call. And people could borrow it. It was such a communal, sharing era. We look back on those days when we put so much into making Zen Center thrive and joke we were slave labor, but we were slaves for each other. On Monday, we might drive Suzuki to Mill Valley to give a talk at Bill Kwong's Indo. Afterwards, we'd go to Kwong's home and have a Japanese-type breakfast with Bill and Laura and the four boys. It was more like a tea ceremony than a meal, though. In tea ceremony, one typically gets a little treat. We'd be served green tea and a dollop of porridge. Surely something else, but not much of it. An austere and peaceful meal. When we left, we'd drive to a place where we could drink coffee and eat pancakes with our teacher. Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was so upset. I'd become aware of and inspired by King in 1963 in my brief experience of college and some involvement in the civil rights movement the following year. I stayed in my room and looked out the window for hours. I could hear other students crying, people on the street everywhere talking about it, sharing, angry. Things were heating up 3 blocks away in the Black Fillmore district. There were crowds of angry people in the street, storefront windows getting broken. Bob and I got worked up, worrying that a full-scale riot would ensue and that it might spread to this area. We ran over to Sokoji, went upstairs and found Suzuki in his office. I called his wife Mitsu over from the kitchen. We told them what was happening and insisted they had to let us get them out quickly to safety. Suzuki's response? "Oh, I think I'll take a walk down to the Fillmore and see what is happening. I'm not afraid of black people. They like me. They like to reach down and put a hand on my bald head, sometimes just a finger." And he demonstrated by placing an index finger on his head and smiling. No, 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 please don't. Please, please, please don't, we begged. Finally, we ended up with a compromise. He and Mitsu would stay there at the temple, and he wouldn't walk down to the Fillmore, and Bob and I would go away. And the commotion in the Fillmore subsided as well. But sadness and anger from the death of King would long linger in our hearts and in the soul of America. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear, lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you, and yours, and all of us, a grand awakening.